All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session called Humanism in AI. We're very excited to be here today and look forward to a great discussion. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this session will be recorded. Audience participation is through the chat only, so you will not be able to unmute yourselves. And please post your comments and questions in the chat. I have with me today three very prominent speakers, which I'm sure most of you have met before or at least heard of. Either way, we'll begin with some introductions, and then each speaker will give a short presentation, and afterwards we'll start our discussion and end with a Q&A from the audience. So let's go ahead and start with the introductions. Tomas, would you like to start?
I would love to start, Ticek. Thank you, and it's good to see everyone here. So my name is Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic. I'm a professor of organizational psychology at UCL and Columbia and the Chief Innovation Officer at Manpower Group.
Great, thanks, Tomas. Lewis, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. So hi, I'm Lewis Garrett. I am a partner at Mercer. Workplace psychologist, worked mostly in the areas of culture, employee engagement, talent, and now most recently future of work. Been living and working in Singapore for the last 10 years plus, and currently I'm in New Zealand visiting family, which is nice, so it's not too early in the morning. So yeah, really excited for this conversation today.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks, Lewis. All right, now finally, Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Taylor. I used to be the chief data scientist for HireVue, so I no longer have an association with them. But I am currently the chief AI strategist for Data Robot, which is a large AI company that works with banks, oil and gas, retail, nearly every vertical that you have available in AI.
Thank you for that, Ben. And as for me, I am Ticek Svensson. I work as a sales director at Cavian Test Security. We work with helping organizations protect their exams from cheating, theft, and fraud. All right, so now that we have all the introductions taken care of, we can go ahead with the presentations. So just a little background, there's a lot of talk about AI and how it has influenced our lives, and more specifically, there are several broad AI risks that most people worry about, and that's why we're here today to address these concerns. But more importantly, we're here to emphasize how AI is actually already making our lives better. So taking these things into account, let's go ahead and start with the presentations. Tomas, would you mind starting with your presentation?
I do not mind at all. So it's a pleasure, in fact. And I guess, you know, what got us thinking about this session was really two things. The first is that in the last 10 years, we have really seen a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence, which only in recent years has brought human intelligence into the equation. And that we see as a really important and interesting opportunity to kind of bridge AI and IO, which is something that we are seeing as a healthy trend in this field, at least in the last 2 or 3 years. If you look even at publications in organizational psychology journals, there's a lot more interest in AI, not just in AI per se, or what this methodology, this tool, this technology can do compared to other forms of exploration for human behavior, but what it actually does to various elements of human behavior, including the workplace. So that, I think, sets the context for what we hope will be a rich and interesting discussion. The second one is that we are contrarian in the position we take with regards to discussions we see in this field, in that while we're not naive as to the risks, the dangers of misapplying artificial intelligence and the potential that poorly designed, poorly executed, poorly supervised, or poorly managed AI has for introducing or augmenting biases, automating unfairness, and making life kind of more robotic, boring, and actually less creative. We're also excited. We remain very excited by the opportunities to actually enhance or augment humanity. And when we think about humanism in its various forms, humanism was born as a philosophical current that really put humans at the center of meaning generation, at the center of agency, at the center of thriving. And it really marked the passage of kind of outgrowing God, to use Richard Dawkins' kind of line, and replacing God with humans, but valuing human agency, intellect, and creativity as the source of all good things and progress. And I think it is a misconception to assume that we're now shifting from humanism to an age of artificial intelligence, because AI is, first of all, a tool created by humans for humans. So I think the critical task for us to explore and understand is in what ways artificial intelligence, as the most important and promising tool in our sort of innovation journey, has the ability to enhance various aspects of life, including work, which is what we're here to discuss. So that's kind of my introduction, Ciciek.
Thanks, that's great, Tomas. What about you, Lewis?
Yeah, so I agree with Tomas's point that we are very excited and interested in the potential and possibilities that AI creates. I mean, so there are a few things I would say. First, a lot of the conversation to me seems to focus on the fact that AI is scaling existing problems more effectively than if we were just doing this with human beings. And I think that fundamentally misses the point, which is the question whether AI can make humanity better. Can it improve the quality of our lives? Can it enable us to make better decisions about people? Can it enable us to lead more meaningful and more fulfilling lives? And can it provide a route through which people can move away from, reduce basically suffering? So, is it because, which I think is a main way, and enhance well-being, which is I think a main way in which society improves. So I think the core point of humanism is asking that question rather than getting into sort of the minutiae of, do we have the right data to train this AI, etc. I think there's a big question that needs to be asked. From my perspective, artificial intelligence changes at least the internal workings of an organization in three fundamental ways. The first is that it completely changes the work itself. So when I join conversations about artificial intelligence, almost all of them are about the impact of AI on HR processes, which I'll talk about in a second. But for me, far more fundamentally, artificial intelligence changes the work that we offer people and has an opportunity to make that work far more meaningful and fulfilling by removing activities that frankly feel meaningless or trivial. And I think in recent couple of years, particularly with the shift to far more digital working, for many people, the opportunity to see work transform has accelerated, and we see many more organizations starting to look at that. I think the other thing that's interesting is if we think about the very tight labor markets, when we see other economies, like let's say in Japan, who have gone through a process of a significant tightening of the labor market due to an aging population, we see automation being a significant contributor to the efficiency and productivity of that nation. But I think we also see that artificial intelligence can be a way for helping to match people to the right kinds of work. So there's a massive opportunity there around the kind of work, the nature of work itself. The second is around how we make decisions about people. Almost all HR processes the non-transactional ones, the ones that add value, are about making decisions about people, predictions about them. And the most common one we talk about in IO is selection. Should I choose who should I choose to do a particular kind of work? And that's a prediction, which is I collect some data about you now, and I try to predict whether or not you will be effective in your job a year or 2 years from now, whatever your time frame is. And AI is a prediction machine. It's far more effective at this. And when people say to me, well, aren't we just scaling human bias? Perhaps, but the point is that there's only, let's say you've got one artificial intelligence that's running that process and providing recommendations. If it is racist and misogynistic, you can see that in the data, and you can update that algorithm to enable more effective recommendations. If you've got 10,000 line managers who are all somewhat racist and misogynistic, what are you going to do? Retrain them all? So for my taste, actually, an artificial intelligence is providing a lot of value, not just in efficiency, but enabling us to solve problems in a far more transparent way. So I think that the decision-making in the HR process is important. The last of the three areas is how we lead and manage organizations. What does it mean for the way that we manage people? And we do a lot of work helping organizations restructure to be more agile, whatever that is, and enable people to flow to work more effectively. AI can help that process, but it really shifts the role of leaders and managers. You're not owning those resources anymore. You're trying to help that resource go where it needs to go. And in some cases, an artificial intelligence is then collecting performance data. And if you think about it, if we always wanted managers to be coaches, engage these people, if you remove a significant component of the evaluative part of that conversation and role, and an artificial intelligence is doing the evaluation and you're just coaching the person to get better, surely that's a much better, more productive position to be in. So, there's a lot to be gained, I think, in terms of improving the quality of leadership if we are able to adopt more artificial intelligence within the general course of work. So I think there's a big opportunity here. I'm not saying that things are perfect, but I think we should see the bigger picture first and then work down from there, rather than worrying about, the current data we have is causing bias in our system. It's like, yeah, we know, but at least we can now see that, and we have an algorithm that tells us when we scale the way that humans usually make decisions, it turns out there's a lot of noise in that data. And if we can see a computer doing it, we can start to figure out how to make better and more effective decisions. And I don't care what anyone says, the best way to eliminate bias and to make better decisions is to provide structure around those decisions. And an artificial intelligence is almost the pinnacle of a structured decision-making process. So that's my view. And I think the biggest barrier to adoption of this is willingness to accept that artificial intelligence can make those kinds of improvements. The technology will, it's just a work in progress. It will eventually generate better results. So that's my view, Chichek. Thanks.
Thanks, Louis. Very interesting. All right, and then we have finally Ben.
So I think to start off, I just want to say I love being here right now with you, with all of you guys. So Chichek, Louis, Tomas, being able to interact with you, learn from you, it's a beautiful thing. And I think before we can dive into this conversation, I think it's good to talk about what does it mean to be human? So to be human, love is fascinating. Love is rational. And I think one of the things that also comes with being human is suffering and pain. So to live a life with love is you're signing up for a life with pain. You're signing up for a life with unimaginable grief. So I'm married. I have 3 kids. Eventually, in the future, I will suffer more than I have in the past. I will have to go through grief. So I think that's interesting to think about. And then you contrast that with AI, where AI is not irrational, it's logical. And this concepts of love and other things and creativity, they're things that aren't normally associated with AI. And before I dive into how I think about AI, I want to tell a really quick story where I had an opportunity to go on an African safari in South Africa, which I would highly encourage people to do if you have that opportunity. And I remember when I was down there, I can't remember if it was the elephants or the giraffes, but our guide was telling us that on average, these animals will walk 20 miles a day. And now you think about the same animal being in a zoo. And I would say most people are trapped in a zoo when you think about what your mind is capable of. So a lot of jobs, a person is working a process or a procedure, they're not unlocking their full potential when that comes to innovation, when that comes to creation and creativity. And with AI, that will allow us to do that, because AI can come into a process, whether it automates it or augments it, and that allows me to focus my attention on a new process. And I think for people that are listening, we are older and we went to school where we had teachers that would yell at us and say, pay attention. And I think that's a funny thing to bring up, because in the moment we had this, the teacher had authority and, you're right, we should pay attention. But hindsight, I would go back and criticize the teacher and say, you were failing to keep my attention. You were no longer earning it, which is an impossible task when you have 30 kids in a room. You can't keep everyone's attention as children. But one of the beautiful things, our ability to learn will be greatly accelerated. So I don't know if this will impact my kids, but likely my grandkids, they will be involved in personalized education thanks to AI that is beyond anything we could imagine. And so I think as humans, we don't really understand our full potential with what we could do, and AI unlocks that. Listening to the other speakers with some of the opens, one of the nice things about AI is it brings accountability to a process. So I think, Lewis, you talked about, we can't really unlock the black box that exists in people. If I'm making a selection process, you can't critique me necessarily. It's hard for you to, but it's even hard for me to explain to you why I selected this candidate if I don't have a process. So I think one of the key things with IO is we introduce a process. We have assessments and selections, and we have validations that we do to show that we are offering lift. And I think AI brings that to all aspects of our lives. We bring a level of process and accountability, whether that's approving loans or making decisions. Should I delay this surgery? What's your risk profile when you come in to get heart surgery, and should I delay that? Are you going to rely on the brilliance of the physician who has limited experience? Another thing to mention too is, what is the definition of intelligence? So intelligence is the ability to acquire knowledge through experience and apply that to future decisions. And there's lots of different types of intelligence. You have emotional intelligence, et cetera. And I think if you go back in time and ask yourself, am I smarter today than I was when I was a child? The answer is obvious. We have gained experience to going through school, interacting with people like yourselves on this panel. They can challenge our perspective and we can get smarter. A fun question to ask, are you smarter today than you were yesterday? That's a hard question to answer, especially when we're older. And experience is not a magical recipe to acquire knowledge and to become smarter, because some knowledge will be biased. You can actually become dumber with your experience. And we see this in innovation, because you get cultures and mindsets where they will say, this is how it's always been done. So I think to wrap up, because I really want to dive into the conversation and the discussion and hear from the audience what they're thinking. AI is, there's nothing we can do to stop it. There's too much good that can come from it. Too many lives will be saved. More and more people will be unlocked from their mental zoos, and they will accomplish things that are inspiring, things that are impossible, things. There is this theme in technology where things that were science fiction are no longer science fiction. You wait 10 years. There's a recent startup that just raised money to resurrect the mammoth. This is a real company. What a wacky world we live in. So you wait 10 years, 20 years, anything goes. So I'll wind down and turn it over, but those are just some rambling thoughts when I think about what it means to be human, and how AI is rapidly accelerating faster than it's ever been in the past, and what does that mean for the future?
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you, Ben. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to post your comments or questions in the chat, and we'll get to them accordingly. So, yeah, you touched upon bias and the word human, humanistic, accountability. So I want to start with talking about AI bias. So we know that most AI researchers are primarily people who are male, who come from certain racial demographics, who grew up in high socioeconomic areas, and primarily people without disabilities. And we also know that AI is developed by humans, and humans are inherently biased. So when inherent bias and diverse user populations are not accounted for in developing and using AI, there are great risks related and discrimination. There are great risks related to bias and discrimination in outcomes. So I want to bring up a recent post made by Richard Landers and Tara Barron. They talked about fairness in high stakes hiring. More importantly, they touched upon the concept of a psychological audit. So they believe that a psychological audit is necessary anytime an AI purveyor makes a psychological claim. For instance, AI is claimed to measure something about a person, like their hireability or potential or leadership skill. AI is claimed to make predictions about a person, like their future performance or turnover risk. And then lastly, AI is claimed to make meaningful decisions about a person, like if they will be directed towards a leadership pipeline or need unique training and development. So based on the fact that AI researchers and their background, what are your thoughts on this psychological audit? How do we manage the risks and discrimination in outcomes?
I'm happy to go first, and I'm in support of it. I think regulation designed to increase fairness and accuracy is not only helpful but also necessary. And I think my only ask would be that we apply similar criteria to every other method or criteria that is used to make inferences about people's potential, suitability, employability, and leadership, right? Which would probably get a lot of people in trouble, not for using AI, but for using bogus, inaccurate, or magical methods. I also want to touch on the first part of your question, Chichek, that is, the issue, the most common source of bias, as Louis mentioned, is, the bias in the training data that we have. The fact that the elephant in the room when it comes to performance is that we lack objective, clear, rigorous, reliable measures of performance. When you measure performance, what you're mostly measuring is popularity, reputation, success, or a manager's opinion of someone. So whatever you use to predict that will only be as accurate as the outcome you have. And so, contrary to popular belief, there isn't like a cult of Silicon Valley, white male engineer bros who are trying to bring down women or all non-whites because they're secretly plotting to train AIs to be as sexist or racist as they are. No, if we don't provide the algorithms with objective, reliable, and unbiased data, even an open-minded human, like all of us present here, as we are, surely part of the open-minded kind of end of humanity, would not be able to avoid such biases and such mistakes, right? So, I mean, if our pre-requirement or prerequisite for programming any technology, any AI is to only use unbiased humans, we cannot use humans at all. And those same people who, yes, they are not maybe demographically diverse or neurodiverse, programmed the tools that we use to navigate, Waze or Google Maps. They work pretty well. They program, the recommendations that we receive about media content, movies, hotels, music. the algorithms are only as biased as the preferences that are used to determine the training data that they use.
Yeah, I mean, so I think exactly the point is, if you're going to audit the AI, a psychological audit on an AI, you need to do it on more or less every significant decision that someone makes about another person in a workplace context, because that would only be fair by definition that you apply the same rules. So it's like, but when you get into that conversation, it's like, yeah, but I can't do that. There are loads of people, and I mean, I can't chase them all around. They're all making decisions. Exactly. So the artificial intelligence is by definition more efficient. So, you know, I do think there's like an underlying issue here, which is that like, if you look at real innovation, if you've watched the Elon Musk, you know, sending to space, like the guy blew up, SpaceX blew up like 100 rockets before the bloody, you know, before they put people in space. They're not afraid to fail. So, you know, you've got to get it wrong a lot. And it's that like acceptance that being incorrect is the fastest way to learn about how to get better. Okay, so the first few tries aren't working to the standard that you want them to work, but that doesn't mean you should stop trying, or that the technology is ineffective. And you know, but Ben's point about accountability is important here. There's a possibility of creating more transparency and accountability in decision making by using technologies like this. I would say though, so that an AI seems to be very good at taking consistent decisions that you need to make across a variety of contexts that we're making a lot of, and putting some structure and predictability around those. It doesn't seem as good at applying that insight or decision-making capability to novel situations. That's where people are better. So, you know, an AI that learned to drive a car is unlikely to be effective at flying a plane. Although, you know, and although I'm sure we learned to fly planes from the ideas associated with other moving vehicles, people are clever like that. So it's trying, and I do think there's a point there that is associated with how different is the context in which you're trying to make the decision that requires some human judgment, because we're good at using small amounts of data to apply to novel situations. But that doesn't make the AI less useful at providing recommendations or input. So there is a bit of a gray area there. Like, when should human judgment be more effective, or when can it be more effective? And how can the AI support more structured decision making, and you know, help to eliminate bias in the broader decision making? So I do think there's an opportunity there.
I agree with a lot of the things that have already been said, and I think it's fun to talk about this concept of good versus evil. So I think the initial question that you asked, Chichek, it kind of hints at intentional evil rather than unconscious bias. So if there are these people developing and coding up AI systems, and I'll say something I might regret, but I don't think I will regret this. So I have a twisted sense of humor, and very early on, a long time ago, 6 or 7 years ago, when things were first getting started at HireVue, we had a very technical team. Everyone on my team had a PhD in physics, and they're doing very technical programming. And at a high level, we understand the types of features that we are working on to build in these AI pipelines. And at the time, I thought it was funny to joke that, well, you know, I'm also coding in eigenvectors to compare facial similarities, so my cousins will get rated higher, or other things that were incorrect. That was never true. But if that was true, that is evil. That's intentional, like I'm being benevolent. If I was doing that, I think what we see with bias is it's unconscious bias, and like Tomas said, it's in all the data. So it's not necessarily the AI systems; it's the data that is fed into it. And I think there's a temptation to think that, well, we will fix the data, that we will balance the data, and that's the wrong perspective. Because you actually just need to partner with the AI to remove the bias. And so bias is guaranteed, like I was mentioning earlier, that through our experience, we will bias decisions, and sometimes we don't even know that we're doing it. And so most of the bad AI examples that I've seen in the news, they're accidental. these groups that have these racist or sexist systems, they were not intentional. A lot of these groups were forced to say, oops, they didn't know that was there. In AI, we actually did some early work where we showed that we could remove bias in the AI models themselves, even though the initial data had the bias, which we could go into more detail on how we could do that. So I think AI is a great partner, and I think the issue is in the data itself. And rather than avoiding bias, I like the idea of just accepting that it's always there. And the other fun thing to bring up is when we think about bias, we think about racism, sexism, and ageism, but there's an infinite number of biases that exist, and some of these aren't protected. So beauty, height, like similarity, there's so many things that we can have biases on, and not everything is protected or even monitored. The last point is, I became a big fan of saying, if I can predict it or measure it, I can protect it. So if there's a bias that is not predicted or measured, with the human process, there's no protection against that bias. And I think the final thought, I've been speaking too long, the final thought is, I hate FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the news. The media is very big about, since anytime AI does something, they'll make it sensational. And I've had some negative pieces written about work I've done in the past with the Wall Street Journal. And you have to ask, what's the next best alternative? So if you don't want AI accelerating resume workflows, what's the next best alternative? Do you want to go back to the human process? Because what we find when you review the human process is you find this unintended, it's the unconscious bias, it's everywhere. So I think that's an important question to ask when we have these sensational news stories about how terrible AI is and is doing these things. Well, what's the alternative?
Can I ask a question to check before? Because
Yeah.
I want to ask something about. Do you have, where do you think we shouldn't be using AI? Like, what kinds of people processes should we avoid using an artificial intelligence? Can you think of any?
Oh,
I'd say we
many.
should, yeah, I'd say one would be, we should make sure that AI isn't used to write articles about how biased humans are against AI for AI to read, because nobody else would.
So AI should not be used where it's manipulating people, but unfortunately it already is. So you look at TikTok algorithms and these different things that are, it's like the crack cocaine for the younger generation. They walk with their phones, but adults can be manipulated too. So if I designed my Alexa to have stateful conversations with me, you can imagine a scenario where I come home and maybe my kids don't want to talk to me, or my wife doesn't want to talk to me, but the Alexa always wants to talk to me. And it thinks I'm the most interesting person in the world. And so I come into the kitchen and it says, how was work today? And I said, I didn't go to work, I went skiing. Where did you go? Did you go to Alta? And I said, no, I did backcountry. Oh, fascinating. So I'm having this conversation with an AI system that'd totally be doable. But what you would find is, even as an adult, I can be manipulated in spending cycles to cough up information for targeted advertising. So now I get an advertisement for an avalanche beacon, which is a very special piece of equipment that should not be a targeted ad to most people. So I think manipulating people is where AI should not play, but unfortunately it's there.
So, I mean, just to continue that. You mentioned learning in the beginning, and one of the things that I think is interesting is that perhaps the most ubiquitous use of AI right now are algorithms to match people with content, usually, but can be experiences. The algorithm technically knows will get that person engaged. Will either prompt a response or generate some kind of behavior that keeps people engaged with a platform, usually. And there are many examples of this. And scaling that up, what's happened is, if you think of a lot of artificial intelligence as a matching technology, in that case, matching to content, but you could have match to music, match to jobs, match to blah, 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 blah. You eliminate the need for search behavior by the user, right? So this person is no longer having to try a tool to look for things that they find interesting. They're no longer, or they're very rarely, banging into things that they don't like or find like, oh, you know, or wouldn't be so engaging. And so they don't see the full breadth of possibilities. They don't see, you know, and this is the kind of social media argument scaled up a little bit. But if we really believe that, and I think this is kind of true, that a lot of personal growth happens outside of your comfort zone, cliche, but I think there's some validity to it. Surely the artificial intelligence is basic, and unless you design it to challenge a person, its main purpose is to remove friction from any kind of process, which to me creates an opportunity for making people just more incompetent generally. So I think a lot about that, which is, you know, in which contexts can it be used, in which should it be used, to create more efficiency, to make some kind of behavior more likely because it's beneficial, and in what way is artificial intelligence actually getting in the way of us being better people, which I think is the point of humanism. And that I think about that and think, like, I get it, making better decisions about who should do what, and there's some wins there, but there are other things where I'm really thoughtful about. I'm not sure that is as good, but I don't think we can stop that. Yeah. At the same time, so I don't quite know how to approach that.
A quick thought to throw in, Lewis, that you're bringing up is, we talk about AI allowing our brain to escape the zoo, but there's AI that will put us in the zoo. So if you're drooling there, not even mentally awake, just scrolling through TikTok videos, they're very engaging and entertaining, but intellectually, you are flatlining. You are not being challenged. You're not becoming what you could. And that is very sad. So I like this thought that you bring up, that AI could actually just put us back in the zoo.
Tomas, you have something to say?
As you can see, I'm very polite here and I'm raising my hand. I learned that recently, actually. You won't believe, you know, I spent the whole lockdown without knowing the feature. No, but I think the aim of any technology is to increase efficiencies. And as we increase efficiencies, we become lazier. So just like, you know, the ubiquitous availability of not just food, but fast food and fattening food makes us obese, unless you exercise self-control and, you know, you exercise this agentic ability humans do have to resist temptation and find life and experience outside our screens. I think this has been the wonderful, you know, maverick and maybe Machiavellian trick of AI or the big tech companies, that their addictive toys, tools, and gadgets have had us all spending most of our time training the algorithms and not utilizing the time we save through these efficiencies into anything else. Other than Ben, who goes to safaris in South Africa, we're all glued to our screens. And it's interesting, you know, people often talk about TikTok for crack for kids. I mean, I tell you, my mother doesn't let her iPad off for a single second. So I think Facebook to our generation and older people is just as addictive and as compelling as TikTok is. So I think this is the humanistic challenge, if you want, that we have to try to find a way to not become a more boring and predictable version of ourselves and to be more than what the algorithms predict about us. If our whole identity and our whole existence is whatever the algorithms predict of us, then that's a very boring and uncreative existence. So I think maybe in the future, Lewis, we will take pleasure in having wrong recommendations made by Netflix and Spotify, and having wrong recommendations made by Tinder and Match.com, because we spend a lot of time fooling the algorithms and doing things we don't really like. And then our real self is our analog self. And that might be the way to rediscover our humanity.
This just makes me think that perhaps it's just another way in which conscientious, emotionally intelligent people will differentiate themselves, that they actually have the discipline not to be sucked into just whatever the AI is recommending. And maybe that's just true. These well, not just conscientious and emotionally intelligent, but people who are interested in not just finding out what's been served to them, but have the discipline and frame of mind to go out and actually learn something. Perhaps that it's just a manifestation of humanity more generally. That's your point, and I think it's a good one.
So I want to stay on this topic for a little longer. During COVID, it kind of became some sort of existential crisis that, how are we going to deal with not being able to see each other? And eventually, we had Zoom fatigue. And now when things are going back to in-person events, I get the sense that for some reason, people have kind of gotten used to Zoom, and it has become like a comfort zone to the point where people actually don't want to leave their homes. They're comfortable in their leggings and they can snack whenever they want, and they can, basically just not be forced to kind of choose between work and their life. It's like it's blended so much that it's become comfortable. And then the few in-person events that I have attended, I noticed that people are actually lacking some of the social skills, or trying to kind of, maybe they need some time to readjust. And because of COVID, we've kind of lost a lot of our equity in our emotional bank. So we actually need to get out and we need to socialize to kind of fill up that emotional bank. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about, do you think that because of what's been happening these past years and technology being so enhanced, that it has actually, or it will change our behaviors as a species, that we don't actually need to be socializing, in person, that this has turned into a habit that is actually acceptable. And then we choose to socialize with individuals whenever we kind of need to, whenever we feel like it, that in work life, at least, that this is actually good, this is comfortable. Do you think that has become like an evolutionary change, or is that even possible?
I guess I can start. It's interesting because I think humans need social interactions just like we need the sun. Otherwise, we will get sick. And one of the most terrible things you can do to a prisoner is put them in isolation for months on end. You go crazy. You need to interact. And I think the key theme goes back to intelligence, because I will learn more interacting with you and with people around me than I will by myself. And actually, it was part of our survival, because before I was either eaten by the lion or not. But when we began interacting with other people, we could share that experience and say, "Oh my goodness, did you see that this happened with this individual? What are we going to do as a group?" And so I think that there's something about being in person that Zoom, I think, just can't recreate. Even for this, we would have loved to have done this in person. We weren't able to for different reasons, but there's something I haven't seen yet digitally that we're still missing. And I think that's something that's very special. And I don't know what you would call that. Like what are we missing?
Yeah, I think, first, I think these are first world problems, right? To have the luxury to do this virtually online, and then say, oh, it would be nice to do it in person. To have the luxury to continue working during a pandemic when lots of people are dying, and now to think about even like hybrid work, how often when people are being bombed and there are wars, so this is a first world problem. But first world problems are good. They're a sign of progress, and that's also I think a reflection of innovations making things better. But my ideal situation would be that all my work happens in Zoom, and actually my work persona has been fully automated. So, whether it's Zoom or the metaverse, and then I can live my life doing other things while that happens. So, Ben, I know that it might be a big ask, but if you can keep working on it, please, you have a client.
Well, Tomas, I'm actually skiing right now. You've been interacting with me on guitar.
Very good. This unfortunately is the real me.
I just usually play a recording of myself nodding and looking interested for an hour, and that seems to sort most meetings out. Yeah, I mean, look, I feel like there's a range of individual differences here. Some people, I find long days on Zoom intolerable, but that's because of my character. And so now I get to go back to an office. I'm happy, frankly. I'm a much better human being. And I think there's a range. I think we've, like many things, the average behavior has changed. So there'll always be people who like to be around other people a lot, and other people who are just like, I don't want to see anyone. It's just not my style. But I do find that, or I think there's some research that shows that even in like people who don't crave social contact like to feel part of communities and groups. Like it's quite satisfying, even if you don't want to contribute a lot in terms of content to that group, you just want to be part of it. So, you know, how do you create that kind of experience, I think is important. I do think that you know, on the topic of how artificial intelligence then is helping to, you know, what it means in that kind of world. I mean, I do think there's a market for an AI that says, go to the office today. Because I think one of the most difficult first world problems we have right now is like, should I go to the office? Or should I just join all on Zoom? Or like, where should I go? And I think people have a great deal of difficulty making that decision. So anybody who's working on an AI that's prompting people where they should be at any given time, I think it could be incredibly valuable, because I think that's a decision that people don't need. Go on, Ben. Please tell me you're working on it.
I had a quick thought that this subjective, we're talking about something that sounds fairly subjective, but there's real data that I can bring up. So I'm actually in San Francisco right now, working with some of our sales enablement, and we've noticed if it's in person, the net promoter score is 91%. If it's virtual, it's 64%. So there's something about being in person that we have not been able to recreate.
Yeah, I just to back that, I can't remember where I got this statistic from, but apparently it takes 3 times as many virtual interactions to build the same level of trust with a person versus in person. So like, if I meet with you 5 times, I built a certain level of trust and familiarity. It would take me 15 Zoom calls with you to build the same level of trust and familiarity. So there's something deeply, human about actually interacting with another person and seeing them physically. I don't know, like if you've met a person that you've only ever interacted with on Zoom and they're taller or they're just physically different in presence, for some reason you feel like you know them better, which is, I think, an important insight.
Okay, so I want to move on to singularity. So there are many futurists who predict that we will reach technological singularity, where machine intelligence surpasses human intelligence and comprehension in less than 30 years. So what are your thoughts on that prediction? And also, if consciousness in AI singularity were possible, how do you think that it would manifest itself?
Someone else want to start, or I can start?
I feel like this is your area, dude. I told you before. I thought you were the singularity the first time I met you.
Well, this is all a simulate. This is just it's not even real life. This is just a simulation right now. So, so the singularity, when we think about the singularity, we can't predict what will happen after that, because you're going to get a breakaway with innovation. So you can imagine the equivalent of 100,000 scientific or nature publications or breakthroughs happening in 10 seconds. What does that mean? Humanity can't even keep up with innovation, which means we will quickly lose it. It'll go out of control. So I'm of the camp, you have 2 camps. Some people feel like it is impossible. And I think those people would, whether it's religious beliefs that there's something very special about the soul that can't be recreated. I'm of the camp that it is possible. I also think this is something that will require an army of people, which is probably good news. So hopefully people can sleep well at night knowing that I can't just go out in the desert and have some brilliant innovation and program it away on a single computer. It will take many, many people to do this.
Yeah, and obviously nobody has data on the future, so we're just really improvising here. And I think it's a question really that kind of invites more to voice a position of optimism or not, or hope or not, or cynicism, skepticism versus confidence in this. I think you first need to have artificial general intelligence before you get singularity. And as of today, it's very, very little signs of that. So I think it might happen. I don't lose sleep over it. I think, before that happens, there are so many opportunities to even leverage very basic individual uses of AI that can improve humanity. And we're not quite there yet. I do find that discussions of singularity usually have a little bit of an apocalyptic undertone or a utopian undertone. And I'm more on the camp that it's hard to even conceptualize what that would be. So not just beyond the 20 Nature publications in a second, I think the whole range of implications is very difficult to conceptualize. So it's almost predicting something that we don't even know what it looks like.
Yeah, so I don't know is the short answer. I mean, I know that there are already many areas in which specific fields where something is more intelligent than humans. A squirrel has a better spatial memory than me, I'm pretty sure. So, there's these kind of other deep examples of different kinds of intelligence that are already way more advanced. So the idea that a machine could, in narrow fields be smarter, but then start to connect those dots, it's not, I think, too far beyond imagination. I do think that there's something about humanity's ability to there's something about the natural exchange of information, like humans as a network, as a system. I think that the chances are that as a collective, human beings will continue to accelerate the acquisition of new insight and be using machines to store and analyze that data, but at such a pace that it will be very difficult for some kind of machine intelligence to accelerate past what people are actually doing. And then I think there's a general question about the utility of some kind of singularity. Like, will we just not develop it because actually it's not that useful, and generally there wouldn't be enough money in it, basically. And so generally the tech engineers are pretty utilitarian, and so you find that we'll never get to it just because there will never be an economic case to have it, type thing. So I think that's also an interesting point of view.
Yeah, just a final point to that, right? So if the point of singularity is, or one of its definition is the point at which machines become more intelligent than humans, I think that's more likely to happen as a result of the generation of human intelligence than the advancement of artificial intelligence. So, if we actually do what we can do to not decline too much based on our behavior and actually harness the positive, productive, and creative traits that we have, then it might take a little bit longer.
I did want to react to one thing that Tomas said. So Tomas is right that we can't predict the future. But with the singularity, there is a backstop point, and that is where we'll get to the compute capacity to simulate the entire brain. So there are people in the AI community that believe we could create the singularity before we needed to do that. But there are estimates and projections that, I forget the exact year, but the next 50 years, we'll have enough compute capacity to simulate an entire human brain if we chose to, which is not really, there's not a lot of innovation from like an AI perspective there, but what does that mean? And then the fun ethics discussion is, if you turn on that brain, is it unethical to turn it off?
Okay, let's take a question from the audience. So this is from Nikki. She's wondering, since its inception in the 1950s, AI has had two winters: dips in interest, application, and funding due to inflated expectations by the AI industry.
Mm-hmm.
Are we heading for a third AI winter? And is AI being inflated to attract investment?
I can answer that really quickly. So Data Robot, we've raised over $1 billion. We're an AI company. I would say it's a brilliant question, by the way. So for people that aren't familiar, there have been two AI winters that were quite painful that we went through, where neural network researchers were almost completely disappeared. I don't think we'll see another AI winter. I think the way I would separate that is 85% of AI projects fail. A lot of AI that's out there is disappointing. It's experimental. I take a lot of pride where I work today, and this will sound pitchy, and I'm sorry for that, but we work with 8 out of 10 of the largest global banks. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of models in production with serious consequences if they work or don't work. We'll go into an oil and gas company and find a $50 million win in 4 weeks. These are real wins. So they're not. So I think the key differentiation is applied versus experimental. We see enough applied value. There's no winter that's coming. The value is real. But I understand that a lot of people out there see failure.
Okay. Anyone else that likes to add something? No? Okay. All right. We can move on to the next question in the chat. Also for Ben, can you go into more detail on how you removed bias from the data in your story from earlier?
Yeah, I'll make this really short. The innovation was actually fairly simple. So you're building an AI system to predict if someone will get a job or have some performance post-hire. You can also build a second AI system to predict the thing that you're most worried about. Can I predict race? Can I predict age? And if you compare those two AI systems, you'll quickly find features or inputs that should be removed. So the classic example would be, if I took that approach with a resume model, if I built a resume model to predict race or gender or age, it would quickly find things like name, sorority, fraternity, where you went to school, and it would remove those beyond what a human is able to do. And so we found by removing features, it blocked the bias transfer. So it's a simple process. Since then, that process has evolved. It's more sophisticated, but that's a great way to start.
Yeah, and I think the key aspect of this, which should be pretty straightforward to understand, is that humans are very good at learning things, but very bad at unlearning things. It's not possible for a human to ignore or forget that the person in front of them or the name in a resume is male, female, Hispanic, Anglo-Saxon, etc. No matter how much time you spend doing unconscious bias training, you just cannot erase these categories, whereas an algorithm can be taught to forget, taught to ignore, and punished if they pay attention to that. So AI can unlearn very, very quickly. Humans struggle to unlearn fundamental basic categories that are actually critical for survival, and there always have been, because for 99.9% of our existence, we didn't want to live in a world that is inclusive. We had no desire or motivation to do so. So I think it's absolutely clear that the advantages are on the side of AI if designed properly. Plus, of course, as said before, when a human makes a hiring decision, it is absolutely impossible to understand why that decision was made. Humans will give you an explanation. You can believe them. Maybe they're even bullshitting themselves. This happens very, very often. We all want to think that the person is getting our thumbs up because they're smart, because they're competent, because they have great culture fit. But how can we know that it's not because, I don't know, they look like our first high school girlfriend or boyfriend, or they said something nice to us? Impossible. Explainable AI is possible, but explainable humans are very, very hard to come by. Mansplaining humans like myself are very, very common.
I can explain you if I have a singularity.
Okay, so I want to talk about another important aspect of AI that we touched upon briefly, privacy. So obviously privacy is an issue. Do you think that by sacrificing our privacy for future generations so that AI can have enough data to work with synthetic data instead, that privacy will no longer be an issue in the future?
Can you restate the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, let me take 2 minutes. So
yeah, so if we sacrifice a lot of our privacy today,
yes.
we're bombarded with all these emails and ads and whatever. And for some reason we're okay with it, or we don't have any choice. But the more data we give up the more privacy we give up, the more synthetic data will be produced. So do you think that it will be enough data in the future, synthetic data in the future, that we don't have to share so much of our privacy?
I think it's entirely context dependent. Like, if you are spending all your time giving away your privacy to a platform that's basically learning about stuff that captures your attention in order to serve you more ads, like to manipulate you, like Ben said, then I do think that there is a regulatory issue associated with that needs looking at. If you're talking about enabling a healthcare organization to figure out how to better predict health, risk factors or other things, then I think it's an entirely different context with much broader benefit to humanity. So, in what context are we talking about privacy? I do think it's interesting that some companies like Apple have decided that privacy will be a business model. It's almost a differentiator for them, which is all about building trust. So, privacy and its flip side, transparency in some contexts, as a trust building tool, I think is very interesting. But I do think that, as we get better at understanding the implications of certain behaviors and the data that's generated from them, we will see improvements in, in better guidelines. I think this is very significantly by different societies. I mean, I live and work in Asia, and there's a very different definition of privacy here. I mean, particularly, in Singapore, where where everything is very open, and the government's constantly collecting data about you all the time. That's the deal for living in the country, and there are many other countries like that. So I do think it's really, really context dependent. I do think there's an important point, which is that the single biggest, one of the most significant challenge of, it's top of my mind for the next 50 years is aging population and the rise of significant healthcare needs more broadly across the economy. So we will see, I think, a lot of focus on well-being, on aging, and these kinds of topics, which will benefit significantly from people contributing data about their general health and well-being. So I think it depends.
I'll jump in real quick. So this topic is one that actually makes me really angry. So I wrote a blog a couple years ago called "Millions Dead Thanks to HIPAA." That's the data privacy law in the US for healthcare data. And which was interesting because that was pre-COVID. So when COVID hit, we were involved working with the federal government using AI to assist. And I had a conversation with a senior health informationist at a large hospital network. And the individual is essentially a data scientist for healthcare. And on the phone, the individual said, "We have not had enough people die to understand the disease. This is why, while thousands of people are dying in New York, but in this hospital network, they'd only had 6 people die. It's not enough data to build a predictive model." And so many, many people unnecessarily died from COVID because of data privacy issues, where we weren't able to pool. And this is not about violating data privacy. It's about having systems that, because why is the data being blocked? It's being blocked through lawyers. And one of the other things to think about, a quarter of you listening will die from heart disease. And right now, we all have a beating heart. We're generating a massive amount of data, but we're not saving it. And a lot of us, if it's up to me, you will not be caught off guard from that. So I'm working on a healthcare partnership right now with a cardiothoracic surgeon, where we want to build AI systems that will run in the ICU and other places to begin analyzing heartbeats. And that is what you want. You want to have your Apple Watch where when you're at the baseball game, it tells you you need to go see your cardiologist in the next 4 months. So we could be very proactive, but unfortunately, because of data privacy, I think we live in a broken system. And I think it's important to talk about the risk versus the reward.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think the key is the benefits, right? It's fairly well known that people don't care as much about their privacy as they say when they complain, which is why even after each of the most scandalous cases that we've had, whether it's Cambridge Analytica or other Facebook kind of stories, or the Snowden saga, etc., everyone is alarmed, but nobody even changes their privacy settings. But I think it is lamentable that we are happy to give away our privacy and to kind of commoditize our privacy without getting that much in return in general. So, I would give twice as much if Ben saves my life because he knows that I'm about to have a heart attack, or that I shouldn't go to the office, to combine it with Lewis's idea of hybrid. Don't go to the office today. Your boss is angry. Better escape. He'll take on someone else. We're having so many innovations. I haven't signed the form release yet for SIOP, so just in case it says they're going to take 20 or 30% of our ideas, I might run it past the legal team first.
Listen, I would subscribe to a technology that says don't go to the office, your boss is angry today. I would sign me up.
You might start with a human in the loop and somebody can give you a call and tell you, right?
Yeah, that's
until we have AI.
I send chocolates to her assistant regularly for that insight.
All right, we have another question. What sort of regulations would you like to see implemented to protect individuals' privacy, but still allowing AI innovation?
Yeah, you go.
Oh, the one that's top of mind is just more transparency and permission seeking. Like, in scientific studies, it's been expected to do that for years, and just commercially, it's like, I don't think, like if you put regulation in, what you're going to be doing is similar to financial services. You're going to be trying to create or enforce more openness, transparency, and other, other elements with your end user, with your customer, so people are really clear. And I think there are some places where that's happening, but I think it will mean that, and you still will see people giving away their privacy because they don't care. But at least, that would be the bare minimum I think we should expect.
Yeah, I think informed consent, transparency, and a benefit on top, right? So that even if people agree by mistake, we still should justify that they're going to be better off because of what you're going to do with the data, or because of what they're going to get back. And I think if you have that, which are fairly generic, generalizable principles of ethical AI or ethics in most areas, it mostly will be an improvement over what goes on now without AI or without technologies.
And I think, just to add to this, I think a lot of the debate around regulation now, particularly where this is most impactful, which is on social media platforms, is whether or not those should be regulated like media. Because at the moment, of course, in many places, there's a bit of a, well, actually, the content isn't ours, which is the platform in which people post content. So moderation, all these sorts of things. And I think there's an interesting question around whether or not these companies should be seen as media, because if you are, then you have some more accountability and responsibility to ensure accuracy. As someone told me once, that if you go for a job interview at the New York Times, they ask you what's the most important thing in journalism. And if you say anything other than accuracy, you don't get a job, which is, because it's like, it's not worth because, it's just not worth the money to post things that are not accurate. So, of course, there's no such accountability in other parts of the ecosystem. So I think that's also important, which is that, the incentives that we get using these platforms, which is back to the point about matching technologies earlier, like, people are, the incentive to keep using these kinds of technologies is that it makes it easier to get content you find engaging, even if it's not very nourishing, like fast food. It's like fast food for the brain. Who is accountable for that? And should there be accountability for that? I think that's still a big question. And that's connected to the privacy statement, because if you had more accountability for that, perhaps you would be trying to promote more accuracy, and by definition almost making your content less interesting, and therefore you would sort of start to balance out how much people are willing to give away to stay on those platforms.
I had a quick thought. Here's an ethical dilemma to throw out to the group for data privacy. So if I said for organ donors that you had preferential treatment for organ donation coming your way. So if I say I'm an organ donor, then if I need an organ, I'm more likely to get one, where if you're not a donor, then you're on the bottom of the list. Some people might not like that, but they might say, well, it seems fair enough. But now let's change it to being a data donor. So if I'm a data donor, should the people who are unwilling to donate their medical data, should they pay a higher price? Should they fund the system? Should there be some preferential treatment? And so, because I think you would have so many people that would give up data privacy quickly for the benefit of society, but then you have a lot of people that refuse to. So it's not to really throw this conversation sideways, but it's a fun ethical question. Or would you withhold those systems from people who refuse to donate data? That would seem evil to me. If you could benefit them, why would we withhold them?
I think, but it's a very idealistic and utopian and intellectualized view, where in this world, most people are very happy to give up their data just to see what their neighbor's cat had for breakfast, or, so I mean, so it's there, but they will still complain that it's disgraceful that companies are using our data, I think if we focus on the benefits, there'll be an improvement, even if dissatisfaction and grumpiness remains high.
The other thing connected to this, which I think is interesting, is perhaps this all is just another way in which we differentiate people. So basically, as we said earlier, the people with the discipline, the focus, and the learning mentality to understand the issues associated with this and navigate it themselves, they're actually actively involved in thinking about these things, are likely to have better outcomes, to manage their privacy more effectively, to realize when they're being manipulated and all these things. And we just create another route in which people differentiate themselves within an economy, which I think that's the same with fast food, right? People who eat well and are conscious about it live longer and, have healthier, happy lives, and those who don't do that are less likely to have those outcomes. And so we've not been particularly worried about that situation. Now we're a bit more worried, put calories on the food and all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of a useful analogy, which is we're very early on in this. And, until we really learn as a society about the negative impacts and start to care about them, this is just not going to change.
Okay, so we only have a few minutes left. I would just like to close this out with one final question, asking you each individually, in what way would you like to see AI improve your life?
To make my wife happy. Buy anniversary gifts automatically, but thoughtful ones that I get full credit for.
So more logistic help then?
Well, I think the serious answer would be scaling. I would like AI to scale the things, to pick up the things that I'm overqualified for, allow me to spend time on the things that are right at my limit.
Yeah, you know, I feel like I'd like an artificial intelligence that would constantly be looking to remove me from my own bubble, which I think is interesting. So anything that would generate more learning for me and for others, I think would be useful. And that doesn't mean like a thing that's going to send me YouTube videos. It means something that's genuinely helping me see where my gaps are and help me see a different perspective. I think would be incredibly useful. I think there are people working on that kind of problem, but I don't think we've cracked it yet, because we're using the let's match this person with whatever content we think is going to be interesting to them, and they're not really seeing the bigger point of on learning. So I would like to see more artificial intelligence investment in that area.
Yeah, for me, I have a more modest goal or desire, which is that AI leaves us a little bit of space, that it doesn't invade, for us to not just not be automated, but for us not to automate ourselves. Like many people here, especially during the pandemic, I'm sure they had similar experiences to mine, where, when you have to do these tedious cybersecurity tests and identify how many wheels there are in a picture, or how many traffic lights there are, or how many trees. I mean, I failed that a few times. So I was beginning to question my own humanity. And I think to the degree that we can still feel human and have humane experiences, AI will continue to evolve, but we should try not to devolve ourselves. That's my only hope.
All right, that's the end of our time. I want to thank all of my speakers, and thank you for all you participants for listening to us. I hope you enjoy the conversation and got some useful information out of it. Thanks everyone again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Thanks, Zizek.
Thank you.
So fun to see you guys. See you all.
All over the world.
Yes.